Perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Michelatu, and this is a video podcast of the member series of ITSS Human Security. In the member series, today we're here with Professor Thijs van Dooremalen of Leiden University, and we are going to discuss climate crisis and policies by the EU and Western countries and the effects they have on human security. Thank you, Professor, for being with us today.
Thank you.
So I'm going to move to the first question. The climate crisis intersects with various other crises such as COVID-19 and the geopolitical conflicts posing additional challenges for policymakers. So how do EU and Western policies account for these interconnected crises, and what strategies are employed to address multiple challenges simultaneously? In what ways do these integrated approaches contribute or hinder efforts to tackle climate crisis and ensure human security on a global scale?
Thank you for this question. So I've worked together with three co-authors on a paper in which we analyze actually the connections between the climate crisis and the COVID crisis. So how are these two crises being interconnected in elections in the Netherlands, United States, Lithuania, and Canada during the year that COVID was like a big thing. So in 2020 and 2021. And then we looked at how the different political parties that were participating in these elections were connecting these two crises. So we didn't look at, okay, which specific issues are they relating them to, or which we didn't choose the parties ourselves. We just looked at all the parties and all the possible connections that they were making. And then for instance, we looked at how much attention they were paying to both crises, to which other issues they were linking them, which strategies they were using to link the two crises, on which level the crises were linked with each other. So you could do it on the local level, on the national level, or on the global, the international level. And what was striking, at least to us, was that there was to a large extent, there were not so many differences between the countries in how they linked the crisis with one another. So whereas you would expect, because we know from other research that often responses to events or crises differ quite a bit between nations, what we find in this study is that the responses are quite similar between the nations, and the most striking differences are existing within the nations. So, for instance, in every nation, in each of the four countries, the left is much more concerned about both crises, so both about climate change and about COVID, and is also making the links more often. And in all countries, if there's a far-right party, then the far-right party is basically more or less denying both crises. So either saying that it's not a big problem, or really saying, well, these are actually not crises. And the real crisis is that we are thinking that these are the crises, whereas we have other crises, such as the migration crisis. And there's various center parties in all countries that are basically saying, okay, to overcome both crises, we need a recovery program, and that involves capitalism. And then the more leftist parties in all countries are basically saying, okay, to overcome both crises, we need to reconstruct capitalism. So we need to build back better, as this was a phrase that was used both by the Democrats in the US as by Canadian parties. And the idea is that to come back from the COVID crisis, we need to reconstruct our ways of organizing the economy and to build back better, so have a better society that can both lead to a recovery of the economy after the COVID crisis, and also a sustainable economy that can help us to solve the climate crisis. So it's quite striking that in all countries we find these patterns, and that the differences are not so much related to what is the country context, but much more which political party is making what claim.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. It was very insightful. For our second question, climate change interacts with pre-existing social and economic inequalities. But however, specific vulnerabilities and policy responses are likely different between EU and Western nations. Can you please compare and contrast on how each region approaches these interrelations, particularly regarding issues, like human security and how people actually take on these new policies?
Yeah. So like I just said, what we found striking in our study was that the differences in approaching COVID and the climate crisis in combination with each other were not as big as we expected. So I think that we could assume that when it comes to the issue of the climate crisis, the approaches are not so different between nations, at least not between, let's say, Western nations, because we studied four nations that could be considered Western nations. And that the question is much more which party is in power within these nations, and not so much that one nation has an approach to the climate crisis that's sticking for decades, Mm-hmm. So let's take the example of the US. The US under Trump, when Trump was president, was not so much in favor of both taking extensive measures to solve either the COVID crisis or the climate crisis. And when Biden came to power, this changed very much so. So Biden came up with a huge program to try to tackle both the COVID crisis and the climate crisis. So it's more related to the change of power that's been happening in the US in 2021, after the elections of 2020, that there was a change in the American position towards the climate crisis. And you could see the same happening in the Netherlands right now. So the Netherlands in the last years has been intensifying its policies regarding the climate crisis. But now, after the elections of a few months ago, where the far right became the biggest party, we can see already in parliament that, the majority, which was very much in favor of stricter climate crisis policies, is basically gone. And there's a new situation where more climate skeptical parties are bigger and also just have more to say about what's going to happen with climate crisis policies. And then we can already see that probably a shift is going to take place in the next years in the way that the Dutch government or the Dutch state is approaching the climate crisis. But this is not so much related to a national difference between the Netherlands and other countries that, that has existed for many years. It is much more related to the fact that the former government included some parties, or the current government still, but the government that was in power for the last year, that includes quite some parties that are in favor of stricter climate crisis policies, investing more in a sustainable economy, a green economy, trying to meet all the measures that were made in the Accord of Paris, and that the parties who are now coming into power probably they are just less in favor of those policies.
Yeah, I understand. So it's a big game going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what you also have expertise on extreme weather events, and I want to ask you that while we have extreme weather events on a global phenomenon, specific impacts to public responses can vary between countries. Can you please compare how EU and Western nations connect these events and the underlying causes of climate change that affect human security?
Yeah, so so the second study that I've done with another colleague relates to the framing, so the discourses about heat waves, and specifically heat waves in the United Kingdom, in Britain. And we've looked at how heat waves are experienced in British public discourse, so in media, from the 1980s until today. And Britain is an interesting case in point because, as most people will be familiar with, the British are always complaining about their bad weather. So there's often a lot of rain. The temperatures are not that high, or even not in summer in Britain. So traditionally, the British are very in favor of heat waves, let's say, because these are at least a few days in which they're experiencing real summer. And the British have big, great memories of, for instance, the British heat wave of 1976. And they're still talking about it. Like for weeks, the weather was beautiful in Britain. And so we could expect that in Britain, the heat wave is considered as something beautiful. And at the same time, the heat wave is, of course, connected with the climate crisis. So we know that as the climate crisis is evolving and intensifying, we will see more heat waves. We are already seeing more heat waves right now than we saw, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago, but it will intensify more. We will have more heat waves, we'll have more temperature records being broken, etc., etc. And so you could think, okay, if the heat wave in the past was seen as something beautiful, how is that today in a country like Britain? And if in a country, even in a country like Britain, this is changing, then probably this is also changing in other countries. For instance, in the south of Europe, where they have much more experience with hot climates, they don't care. They care less about heat waves because they have a heat wave every year, basically. You know, their whole summer consists of heat waves. So what we find is that indeed, even in Britain, the idea of the heat wave as something beautiful is now changing. So what we see that in the 1980s, on the one hand, the heat wave was often connected to going to the beach, going on holidays, eating ice cream. So let's say the pleasures of summer life. And on the other hand, it was related to people dying because of a heat wave, construction problems because of a heat wave. So these two, let's say, framings or genres of looking at the heat wave, one a romantic one and another apocalyptic one, were standing next to each other. And they were both quite dominant, so there was a mix. And what we see is that over the decades, so beginning in the 1990s and intensifying in the last, let's say, 10 years, the idea of the heat wave as something beautiful is disappearing a little bit. It's still there, but the let's say the amount of news, the amount of people talking about the heat wave as something beautiful is decreasing. And what is increasing is very much a view on the heat wave as something dangerous. So something that makes people die, but also something that's very much related to the climate crisis. So we see that in the 1980s, even though there was already knowledge about the climate crisis, the idea that the heat wave is connected to the climate crisis was not so dominant. Today, when the British in the media talk about the climate crisis, talk about heat waves, it's often related to the climate crisis. So often they will say, yeah, we have a heat wave now. It's nice, but it's also a big danger. So even in Britain, this has changed. So given that even in Britain it has changed, we expect that it has also changed in many other countries, and that basically in probably most countries, at least in Europe, that we would study, we would find that extreme weather event, and the extreme weather event, the heat wave, which is not like flooding, which is always negative, but something that can also be seen as positive, that even this extreme weather event is now very much colored as something that's related to the climate crisis. And you could say that that's something positive, because it means that politicians and scientists who are worried about the climate crisis have like a vehicle to talk about, to mobilize worries about the climate crisis. Because if there's a shared understanding that the heat wave is something worrisome, then politicians can also use this and say, if there's a if there's an extreme weather event in the form of a heat wave happening, they can refer to it and say, look, this is what's going to happen if we don't do anything about the climate crisis. We need to make more investments. We need to meet the standards that are set by the IPCC and by the climate crisis conferences. So in a way you could say that something positive that this framing has changed.
Well, that is something that we didn't expect to hear, as something as extreme weather event being something positive. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for all your insights, and thank you for being with us here today. To all of us watching, stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you very much.